Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Whispers in the Dark. The funeral service for George Whitaker was held on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky seemed to mourn alongside the living. Helen stood by the gravesite, gripping the small umbrella she shared with her husband, Mark, as they watched the casket lower into the earth. She felt Ethan's tiny hand clutching her skirt, his innocent giggle breaking the somber atmosphere. "Papa is funny," Ethan said, pointing at nothing in particular. Helen forced a smile, unsure how to respond. Her son had always adored his great-grandfather, even if George's affections were more subtle than overt. George had a way of showing love in small gestures. Silly faces when he thought no one was looking, a soft chuckle at Ethan's antics. Those fleeting moments were now memories Helen clung to tightly. As the ceremony ended, the family gathered at Margaret's home for a modest reception. The house, once filled with George's quiet presence, now felt hollow. Helen moved from room to room, noticing little reminders of him. The chair he always sat in, the crossword puzzle he had left unfinished on the side table. It wasn't until she found herself alone in the living room that Helen noticed something odd. The air seemed colder there, the kind of chill that raised goosebumps. She shrugged it off, attributing it to her imagination, but a faint sound stopped her in her tracks. A soft chuckle. Helen turned sharply, but the room was empty. 2 nights later, Helen was jolted awake by the sound of Ethan laughing. The clock on the nightstand read 2:14 a.m. She groggily reached over to nudge Mark, but he was sound asleep. "Ethan?" she called out, but the laughter continued. Climbing out of bed, Helen padded down the hallway toward the living room, where she found Ethan sitting cross-legged on the rug, his back to her. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtains. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Helen asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Ethan turned to her with a wide grin. "Papa is funny," he said, giggling again. A shiver ran down Helen's spine. She quickly scooped Ethan into her arms and carried him back to his bedroom. As she tucked him in, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Did you see Papa?" she asked hesitantly. Ethan nodded. He made funny faces. Helen left the room, her heart pounding. She spent the rest of the night lying awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house. The next morning, Helen dismissed the events as a combination of grief and exhaustion. Mark, ever the skeptic, shrugged off her concerns. "It's just his imagination," he said over breakfast. "Kids that age say the weirdest things." Helen nodded, but the unease lingered. That evening, as she was tidying up the living room, she noticed something peculiar. A framed photo of George that usually sat on the mantelpiece had been moved. It was now on the coffee table, facing outward, as if deliberately placed. "Mark, did you move this?" she called out. "Move what?" he replied from the kitchen. "The picture of Grandpa." "No, why?" Helen didn't answer. Instead, she carefully placed the photo back on the mantel and tried to ignore the way her hands trembled. The following night, Helen's sleep was interrupted again, this time by the sound of footsteps. She sat up, straining to hear. The soft thuds seemed to come from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" Mark listened for a moment before sighing. "It's probably just the house settling." But Helen wasn't convinced. She slipped out of bed and cautiously opened the door, peering into the dimly lit hallway. "Ethan?" she whispered, but there was no response. Gathering her courage, Helen stepped into the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. She followed the noise to the living room, where she found the rocking chair swaying gently, as if someone had just stood up from it. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The room was silent, save for the faint creak of the chair. The days that followed were filled with small, unexplainable events. Lights flickered without cause, objects seemed to shift positions, and Ethan's laughter became a nightly occurrence. Helen began to feel like a stranger in her own home, constantly on edge. One afternoon, while visiting Margaret, Helen decided to share her concerns. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked hesitantly. Margaret gave her a knowing look. "Why do you ask?" Helen recounted the strange events, expecting her grandmother to dismiss them. Instead, Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "George always said he'd never leave us," Margaret said softly. "He was a man of his word." The conversation left Helen more conflicted than ever. Was it possible that George's spirit was still lingering, keeping watch over the family? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? The climax came on the 1-week anniversary of George's funeral. Helen and Mark were in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when they heard Ethan laughing again. This time it was louder and more infectious than ever. Helen and Mark exchanged a look before hurrying to the living room. There was Ethan, sitting in the same spot on the rug, his face lit up with joy. "Papa's here," he exclaimed, pointing toward the rocking chair. The chair began to rock gently on its own. Helen felt a lump rise in her throat as Mark froze beside her. For the first time, even his skepticism wavered. "Ethan," Helen whispered, "can you say goodbye to Papa?" Ethan turned toward the chair and waved. "Bye, Papa." The chair stilled, and the room grew eerily quiet. After that night, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that her family wasn't alone in the house. While Mark dismissed the incident as an odd coincidence, Helen found herself scrutinizing every shadow, every sound, every small detail that seemed out of place. "I think we should talk to someone about this," Helen said one evening as they sat on the couch, the faint hum of the TV providing some background noise. Mark frowned, flipping through his phone. "Someone like who? A therapist? A priest?" "Maybe both," she muttered under her breath. Despite her growing unease, Helen tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Ethan's sake. She spent her days playing with him, keeping him distracted from anything that might seem unusual. But Ethan was an observant child, and his innocent remarks often sent chills down her spine. "Papa sits there," he said one afternoon, pointing at the corner of the room where the sunlight didn't quite reach. Helen glanced at the empty space and forced a smile. "What does Papa do?" "He watches us," Ethan replied simply before turning back to his toy cars. 1 week after Ethan's late-night encounter, Helen received a call from Margaret. "Helen, dear, are you free to come over today?" Margaret's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made Helen pause. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "I just found something," Margaret said, her tone guarded. "It might explain things." When Helen arrived at Margaret's house, she was greeted with a hug and ushered into the living room. On the coffee table sat a worn leather journal, George's journal. "I thought he threw this out years ago," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "But I found it in his old desk this morning. It's peculiar." Helen opened the journal, flipping through the pages filled with neat handwriting. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary: dates, reminders, mundane reflections. But as she reached the final entries, the tone shifted. "I hear them at night," one entry read. "Whispers I can't explain. I feel like I'm being watched." Helen's heart raced as she read on. George had described a series of events similar to what she was experiencing now. Unseen presences, objects moving, Ethan laughing in the middle of the night. "What do you think it means?" Margaret asked. Helen shook her head. "I don't know, but I think we need to be careful." The journal haunted Helen, but she didn't tell Mark about it, knowing he would dismiss it as nonsense. Instead, she decided to do some quiet research. She spent hours online, reading about similar experiences, but nothing gave her a definitive answer. One evening, while Helen was at the grocery store, she ran into an old family friend, Bill Harper. Bill had worked with George for years and had attended the funeral. "How are you holding up?" Bill asked, his face lined with genuine concern. Helen hesitated before answering. "It's been strange, honestly." Bill gave her a knowing look. "Strange how?" She explained the events in vague terms, careful not to sound paranoid. Bill's expression darkened as she spoke. You know, George wasn't always as quiet as he seemed, Bill said. He talked to me once about something odd at his house. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks. But maybe what? Helen pressed. Bill hesitated. Maybe it wasn't. That night, Helen couldn't stop thinking about Bill's words. She decided to dig deeper, starting with the old desk where George's journal had been found. Margaret had offered to let her go through it, hoping it might bring some closure. As Helen rummaged through the drawers, she found nothing out of the ordinary. Old receipts, letters, and trinkets. But the bottom drawer was locked. Do you have a key for this? Helen asked Margaret. Margaret shook her head. If George kept it locked, there must be a reason. Helen stared at the drawer, her curiosity growing. She decided to bring the desk home and try to open it later. Using a small screwdriver, Helen managed to jimmy the lock open late one night after Ethan had gone to bed. Inside, she found a collection of photographs, a stack of letters, and another notebook. The photographs were old and faded, but they all featured George at different stages of his life. In several of them, a shadowy figure loomed in the background. Unremarkable at first glance, but unsettling upon closer inspection. The letters were addressed to George but had never been sent. They spoke of strange occurrences in the house, moments of fear and confusion. The notebook was filled with more detailed accounts, including one entry that made Helen's blood run cold. Ethan sees them too. He laughs at night. I've tried to protect him, but I don't know how much longer I can keep them away. As Helen delved deeper into the mystery, the strange events escalated. She began to feel watched even in broad daylight. Her movements were followed by soft creaks in the floorboards. Doors that she was sure she had closed were left ajar, and the unmistakable feeling of a presence just out of sight. One night, Ethan woke up screaming. When Helen rushed to his room, he was huddled in the corner, his face buried in his hands. Ethan, what happened? She asked, kneeling beside him. They don't like you, he whispered, his voice trembling. Who doesn't like me? Ethan pointed toward the doorway, but when Helen turned, there was nothing there. Helen couldn't ignore the signs any longer. She decided to contact a professional, a paranormal investigator who came highly recommended. While Helen wasn't sure she believed in ghosts, she needed answers, and this seemed like the only way to find them. The investigator, a middle-aged woman named Carla, arrived the following afternoon. She carried a bag of equipment and a no-nonsense attitude. I'm not here to scare you, Carla said. I'm here to find the truth. Over the next few hours, Carla conducted a thorough investigation, using EMF meters, audio recorders, and cameras. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as the sun set, things began to change. The EMF meter spiked in the living room, and faint whispers were picked up on the audio recorder. Do you hear that? Carla asked, her eyes narrowing. Helen nodded, her heart pounding. It's faint, but it's there. Someone's trying to communicate. When Carla reviewed the footage and audio later that evening, she found something chilling. A shadow moved across the living room, distinct and deliberate, yet there was no one there. The whispers on the recorder were clearer now, repeating a single word. Ethan. Carla looked at Helen with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Whatever this is, it's attached to your son. The days following Carla's investigation were marked by an unsettling quiet. The activity that had plagued the house seemed to subside, but Helen knew better than to trust the calm. Ethan, once cheerful and talkative, grew increasingly withdrawn, his once vivid laughter replaced by silence. Is he all right? Mark asked one morning, glancing at Ethan as the boy stared out the window, his breakfast untouched. I don't know, Helen replied. He hasn't mentioned Papa in days, but something's still not right. Mark sighed, his skepticism cracking under the weight of Helen's growing fear. Maybe we should stay somewhere else for a while. Helen nodded, relieved that Mark was finally taking her concerns seriously. But deep down, she knew running wouldn't solve their problems. Whatever was happening, It wasn't confined to the walls of their home. It was tied to them. That evening, Helen decided to revisit the contents of George's desk, hoping to find something she'd overlooked. As she sifted through the old letters and photographs, she noticed an envelope tucked inside the notebook. It was addressed to Margaret but had never been opened. Helen hesitated before sliding the letter out. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a moment of distress. "Margaret, if you're reading this, something is terribly wrong. I've been hearing voices, seeing things I can't explain. Started after Ethan was born. He laughs at night, talks to people who aren't there. I think they're trying to get to him. Please, keep him safe." The letter ended abruptly, as if George had been interrupted. Helen's hands trembled as she folded it back into the envelope. Later that night, as she lay awake next to Mark, Helen heard the faint sound of laughter coming from Ethan's room. Her chest tightened as she got up to check on him. When she opened the door, Ethan was sitting in the middle of the room, his back to her. "Ethan?" she called softly. He didn't respond. Helen stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Ethan, who are you talking to?" Ethan turned slowly, his face pale in the moonlight. "They're here," he whispered. Helen and Mark decided to leave the house the next morning. They packed a few essentials and drove to Margaret's house, where they planned to stay for a few days. Margaret welcomed them with open arms, but Helen noticed the worry etched on her face. "I found this," Helen said, handing Margaret the letter. Margaret read it in silence, her expression growing more troubled with each line. "I knew he was struggling, but I didn't realize it was this bad," she said finally. Determined to find answers, Helen reached out to Bill Harper, hoping he might know more about George's final days. Bill agreed to meet them at a local diner. "George never told me much," Bill admitted over coffee. "But I know he believed something was following him. He tried to ignore it, but it seemed to get worse after Ethan was born." "Did he ever say why?" Helen pressed. Bill hesitated. "There was an incident years ago, before you and Mark were married. George never liked to talk about it, but I think it has something to do with all of this." The incident Bill referred to was a car accident that had occurred over a decade ago. George had been driving late at night when he hit a pedestrian on a rural road. Panicked, he left the scene without calling for help. The man's body was discovered the next morning, but the case remained unsolved. Helen was stunned. "Why didn't he ever say anything?" "Guilt eats away at a man," Bill said. "But sometimes, it doesn't stop there." Helen couldn't shake the feeling that the accident was connected to what was happening now. She decided to visit the site of the crash, hoping it might provide some clarity. The site was unremarkable. A stretch of road lined with trees, the pavement cracked and uneven. A small wooden cross marked the spot where the man had died, a faded photograph attached to it. As Helen knelt to examine the cross, she noticed a name etched into the wood: Michael Carter. Later, she searched for records of the accident and found an obituary for Michael. He had been a father of two, a beloved teacher at the local high school. The thought of George carrying this secret for so long filled her with a mixture of anger and pity. But as Helen dug deeper, she discovered something even more unsettling. Michael's wife, Linda, had died by suicide a year after his death. Their children had been placed in foster care, their lives shattered. When Helen returned to Margaret's house, she told Mark everything. He was furious, not just at George but at himself for never noticing the signs. "What do we do now?" Mark asked, his voice strained. "We need to make things right," Helen said. They decided to visit Michael's children, now adults living in a nearby town. The meeting was tense, but Helen explained everything, including George's letter and the strange events surrounding Ethan. "I don't know if this will bring you any peace," Helen said, "but I'm so sorry for what my family has done to yours." Michael's daughter, Sarah, nodded silently, tears streaming down her face. "Maybe it's time to let go," she said. That night, back at Margaret's house, Helen felt a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. But as she lay in bed, a familiar sound reached her ears: Ethan's laughter. Helen rushed to his room, her heart sinking when she saw him standing by the window. "Ethan, what are you doing?" He turned to her, a smile on his face. Papa says it's okay now. Helen's breath caught. What do you mean? He says he's sorry, Ethan said. And he's leaving. The next morning, the house felt different. Lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Ethan seemed back to his usual self, laughing and playing without a care in the world. Helen couldn't explain what had happened, but she chose to believe that George had found a way to make amends. As they prepared to return home, Helen took one last look at the letter George had written. She folded it carefully and placed it back in the drawer, a silent promise to never forget the lessons learned.